this. It's a little different. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Sydney Carter. I'm the Ready Program Manager at NBHP. Thank you for joining our August CEU training this month. I'm pleased to present to you Dr. Whitney Krausen. She's a licensed clinical psychologist at the Children's Assessment Center here in Houston. And we're going to talk about child sexual abuse, core dynamics, and implications today over these 2 hours. And as a reminder, 2 hours of CEU credit are available, so long as you are able to join the meeting at 10:15 a.m. and stay by 10:15 a.m. and stay for the whole duration, the 2 hours, and take the CEU survey that will be placed in the chat at the end of this training. And let me think. The recording of this presentation and the slides will be available afterwards. So without further ado, I will ask everyone to introduce themselves in the chat if you'd like. And please feel free to ask questions in the chat unless our host indicates coming off mute. And please enjoy Dr. Crossan's presentation. Without further ado, here, introducing to her now.
Good morning. Just want to make sure everyone can hear me well. If there are any problems, please let our host know. I am Dr. Whitney Krausen. I'm a clinical psychologist at the Harris County Children's Assessment Center. Been working here for probably 11 years or so. And my primary role here is to provide mental health services to children and their families after allegations of child sexual abuse have been made. I also work in the courts. So I am, I guess, the primary expert for crimes against children. So I'm a little bit half here and also half in court during the week. So I'm talking about this all the time. I do want to put out there that some of you, if you've worked with this population before, some of this is going to be familiar to you. I did try to find the most updated statistics though, so maybe some of it will be new, but a lot of this is going to be familiar if you've already worked with this population. It is a 101, if you will, on this population. So I'm okay if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question. Whatever you feel most comfortable doing. We can also wait till the end. It's up to all of you. So I will just get going. So in this, I don't know if there we go. So in this presentation, we will be talking about just what is child sexual abuse, trying to define that. You'll learn that there's not really a certain definition for child sexual abuse, but we'll go over a little bit of that, the processes that are involved. We'll also talk about characteristics of perpetrators as well as vulnerabilities of victims. We'll talk about different signs and symptoms of abuse and or trauma, hopefully to help those of you who do not work with this population to be able to recognize some of those signs or symptoms. And also talk about different methods of prevention, the ways we respond to this, to these types of allegations, and to the signs and symptoms that we may see. Okay, so Matthews and Colin Vizina, they did a good job of highlighting the variations in how we conceptualize child sexual abuse. And then they really put it, they highlighted the different ways in which we define child sexual abuse. And I'm sure some of you have noticed there are differences in the way society might define it, the way research defines it, the way legal policies and practices define it, even in therapy, the way we respond to this problem. There's really no true definition, but they did break it down into 3 different dimensions, essentially. So one is the definition of the construct of child sexual abuse, and this involves 3 different aspects. One aspect is the child's age. So there are some people who would consider 17-year-olds to be children. The law here in Texas does not define 17-year-olds as children. They define 17-year-olds as adults when it comes to child sexual abuse. CPS defines a child as anyone under 18. So there's a conflict there. You might see that some people define adults as someone who is 5 years old or older, or 5 years or more older than the victim. And that would constitute child sexual abuse. There's just a lot of variations in what the age range should be. Relationship with the abuser. Again, there are differences in how we conceptualize that. So for Child Protective Services, they would say that for child sexual abuse, and for them to be involved, the abuser must be someone who is providing care to the child. So a parent, a babysitter, a coach, a teacher. Those are the only ones they would investigate as someone who is in a caregiving role. Whereas law enforcement, it's anyone who has sexually assaulted someone, whether they are 1 year apart, the same age, 2 years apart, that is a legal matter that they will take up. But CPS, that's not something that they would look at because they're looking at the relationship and if there was some sort of power differential. Also, the element of sexual gratification. Again, you'll see this much more often in law enforcement, wanting to know if the abuse was for that purpose, was for some sort of sexual gratification. Whereas in other fields, and other practices, that element might not be present. Then you have the next dimension, which is what acts may actually constitute sexual abuse. You find differences in this, mostly in research, I would say. Some research only defines the abuse as penetration, whereas other areas and other types of research would include inappropriate touches. And so it really, there's a wide variation within this dimension. Then you have the nature of consent. So that could be anything between just absolutely saying, no, I don't want this, to what some of us would call adaptive cooperation. They are cooperating with the abuser because they're surviving, they're adapting to the situation because they're afraid of what may happen if they do not cooperate. So some might look at that as consent, where we know that that was not consent. It was forceful, it was coercive, things of that nature. So if you haven't ever thought about the definition of child sexual abuse before, these are some of the issues that we have with defining it and the variations. And it's actually trying to define it is really in its infancy. We don't really have a strong definition of it that exists and aligns with definitions across different fields. If anyone has any questions about that, you can let me know, but I know it can be kind of confusing. Okay. So what they've done, Matthews and Colin Vizina, I always have a problem with that name, is they have proposed a definition. Their proposal is they've broken it down into 4 different conditions that must be met in order to define it as child sexual abuse. Now, this is a very abbreviated version. I'm going to give you these 4 conditions, but this could be hours talking about this one slide. So I'm just going to give you the 4 conditions and we'll just kind of move on. But their proposal is the age factor. So an act that involves a child that is defined by either legal age or their developmental capacity. And again, like I mentioned, here in Texas, for child sexual abuse, not all crimes, but for child sexual abuse, a child is 16 or under. They are under the age of 17. So either that age, the legal age, or their developmental capacity. If they are not functioning at an age of 17 or older, then they would be considered unable to give consent, and then it would fit this condition. The second condition is regarding consent. So were they able to give true consent? If they do not meet the age capacity, then they are not able to give consent. But if they are able to give a consent, but did not give true consent, such as they felt forced or coerced, manipulated, into it, then that is also not, that condition would be met if they did not give true consent. An act seeking physical or mental sexual gratification for the abuser. So that's one that I was mentioning earlier that is really important for the legal definition. But for this definition, they say it could be that, or the child considered it to be a sexual act. And I don't know how many of you look into these cases or follow them through trial, but what I've noticed in my experience in trial is oftentimes the decision will hinge on whether or not the perpetrator was doing this for sexual gratification. And then how do you prove that? It's very murky. It's very a gray area. So not only what their proposal is not only is the sexual gratification an element, but it could be that, or if the child perceived it to be a sexual act. So the fourth condition is an act that occurs within a relationship of power. And I think this is a really important condition. Sometimes people will try to say that a teen or young teen or an adolescent is a perpetrator of abuse, but we really want to get away from that. And say there's a new term for them. It's called youth with problematic sexual behaviors, and it's a really it's a growing field. You can get licensed providers to work with these kids and work on just redirecting their behaviors and teaching them about boundaries and things like that. Because the research says if they are to do this at an early age and get some assistance with that, then it's very rare for them to go on and continue to abuse, because oftentimes it's more out of curiosity or not knowing what boundaries are appropriate and things like that. But so this fourth condition is really to highlight the power differential in an authority figure abusing a child. So that needs to exist as well, where the child's vulnerability is exploited and it is without true consent. So these are the four conditions. Like I said, we could talk for hours on these conditions because there's still some gray area here, but this is the proposed definition that I think is a pretty good one. It's the only one I've actually seen out there, but it's something that I'll be watching to continue to see how it develops here in the future. But so, all right, in Texas, I've sort of touched on this already, but what is sexual abuse? So sexual abuse is engaging in sexual acts with another person without that person's consent. Now, consent, it cannot be coerced. It cannot be forced. It cannot be given if the victim is unconscious, in a state of unawareness. So that could not be consent. It has to be provided by someone who knowingly and willingly is giving that consent. The sexual acts can include contact and non-contact behaviors. Also, in the case of child sexual abuse, there's often a discrepancy in age between the victim and the offender. Like I mentioned earlier, for Texas child sexual abuse, the child is a person younger than 17 years old. You'll sometimes see some conflict when you're working on a case where there's CPS involvement, because the CPS involvement views that age as still a child when it might be legally viewed as an adult. So there's some conflict in the way that they approach things. But the next slide about the 3-year rule, I'm not sure if any of you have heard of this. So essentially, if a child is 14 years old, legally, it is illegal for someone who is 17 years old to have sex with a 14-year-old. Now, this can become problematic, particularly when you have 14-year-olds to 18-year-olds in high school together, and they're all treated as equal or same. And so you might have some who are engaging in consensual relationships with each other. Sexual activity may become involved. And the 3-year rule is essentially saying that if the older person in that relationship is no more than 3 years old, older than the victim, then it likely will not get prosecuted. It's what they call an affirmative defense to prosecution. But legally, statutorily, they could be held accountable for that. Now, if the child is younger than 14, then the 3-year rule does not apply, and anyone over that. So if anything above 2 years older would be considered statutorily illegal. That can be confusing. Again, if you have any questions about that, please let me know. But some people refer to this as a Romeo and Juliet law, but that is not what this is technically, and law enforcement will say we don't have that law, but this is what you would call it. It's just this 3-year rule that someone 3 years older cannot have sex with someone 3 years younger. But if the younger one is 14 years or older, then there's some flexibility with that. All right, so child sexual abuse statistics. I almost did not put this first bullet in here because it really depends on what research you're looking at, because you can get all sorts of statistics on this. But according to the CDC, 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 20 boys are sexually abused in childhood. I spent a lot of time recently trying to update this statistic, and this is the most updated I could find. It's from 2020, but it's just growing. We're learning that this is a very difficult statistic to actually determine because of what we know about non-reporting, and also, again, like I was talking about in the beginning, research does not always include all acts of sexual abuse. So, so it is really, really difficult to determine this number. But according to the CDC, this is it right now. 90 to 95% of child sexual abuse victims know their perpetrators. Overwhelmingly, it is friends of the family, but also family members are also involved in that. But oftentimes it is very close loved ones, friends of the family that are the perpetrators. And this is due to access to the children, opportunity, and the trust that they have by the children and by those around them. You know, it's really important to remember that adults don't have just free access to children. They have to gain that access somehow. And so they have to first look at the lot of children which they have access to determine how they're going to get that opportunity and be able to perpetrate effectively their abuse. Now, according to the Texas Department of Public Safety, in 2024, now this includes child and adult counts, but there were 20,620 counts of sexual assault in Texas in 2024 that were reported. I think the staggering issue here is that almost 70% of those occurred in the home. So we have 13,840 that occurred within the home. Then you have over 500 in an elementary school, 350 or so at a doctor's office or a hospital, a drugstore. Then you have some at playgrounds, churches, daycares. This is not all of the locations that they reported on, but these are the ones I just put in here because they're more likely to be involved with children. Now, again, this number does include both children and adults. They did not separate those in the research, but that's what we have here. Now, the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So this number is also very difficult to determine because this is based on the number of calls regarding human trafficking. I know that Houston is known for its prevalence of human trafficking. Out of the approximate 8,000 sex and labor trafficking that were reported in the US in 2024, a little more than 800 were from Texas. Given that we are one of the, if not the largest states in the US, it's kind of, that number just doesn't really seem to be what you would expect, but that's what they reported. So, and again, this is just sex and labor trafficking. This isn't all types of trafficking, but the kinds that involve sex, as well as sex and labor. Now, this number is also down from the 2022 statistics for Texas by 17%. So while it is still something that we see quite often, we are hoping that our efforts to raise awareness and to prevent this is working. We'll see when the next year's statistics come out, but I do think one of the main issues here is that it's not reported as often as it is happening. So, so this again is just based on what is reported, not necessarily what is actually occurring. And so one of the questions that I get most frequently regarding trafficking is how much of this is international versus domestic, how much of it is crossing borders, and I can't tell you the statistics on that, but I can tell you my experience. And my experience is that most of it is domestic. Most of what I see is domestic. You have all sorts of people that are trafficking. You have parents who traffic their children. Then you have you have pimps who will trick girls into thinking they're in relationships with these guys, and then slowly they will become someone who will traffic them out. And again, that's another area that we could talk on for hours in its own presentation as well. But I do want to just put out there that this is not an international problem. Well, there is an international problem, but this is not just an international problem. It is also a domestic problem. And I see frequently parents who do this with their children for extra money, just any sort of gain that they can get from it, unfortunately. So more statistics that are more specific to Texas. Now, what you'll see here is overwhelmingly you have more female than male victims. Again, that is victims that have reported this abuse. Now, in Texas, they do not differentiate white victims from Latino or Latinx victims. And so they are bulked together. I'm not sure why, but they just are. So that is one reason why the white victim population count is much higher in this slide, is because of that reason. Now, what I've done here is I have separated it into male and female, but what their information provided, what their website provided, was different age ranges. So I could not get just child sexual abuse because it went from under 10, under 14 to 15 to 19. So I was unable to separate ages 15 to 19, but total, when you're looking at the white victims, you have a total of 8,631 from the year 2024. Over 7,000 of those were female. About 1,200 were male. Again, this doesn't necessarily mean that is the actual discrepancy in male versus female, but we know that males do not report as soon as females do, or as often. So so that's going to be a deflated number from the already deflated number due to low reporting. But if you were to then separate those who were 14 years or younger, it's still over 5,000 of this number were 14 years or younger. So overwhelmingly, there were children in this from this amount, the over 7,000. Most of them were 14 years or younger. Then you have the Black female, which is 1,800 to only 389 Black males reporting. Then you have the American Indian female, which is 17 of those. And then you have American Indian male, which is 2. You have the Asian American females, 76, Asian American males, 20. The Hawaiian Pacific Islander, we only had 9 reports of that. Then we have the unknown, what their ethnicity was. That is the 257 unknown, 52 unknown male. This next slide though does separate them by race. And still you'll see an overwhelming amount of white people reporting. A lot of this tends to do with culture and how they deal with this type of thing. Sometimes they, like different populations will keep things in the family. They're taught to keep things in the family. They are taught this is not something that you discuss outside of the home. The danger in that is is that by doing so, we are encouraging silence. And so hopefully this will start to change in the future, but it's still a very salient problem. I see that all the time in my work. I'll have kids come in who say that their parents were abused, but they weren't allowed to talk about it. This is particularly true in marginalized cultures. They just aren't allowed to talk about it. They aren't allowed to speak of it, especially outside the family. Oftentimes they aren't allowed to speak about it inside the family. And so this just raises that problem of silence. So I do hope that as we continue to raise awareness and as we continue to talk about this, that does start to change. Are there any thoughts or any questions so far? I feel like I'm kind of breezing through without giving anyone a chance to say anything. No? Okay.
There was just one question in the chat so far. And I'm gonna pull it up there. And if you want to wait, I understand too. But the question is, what if the abuser is not at an age mental capacity? Will they still be held accountable?
That's a good question. So that depends from, I'd have to know more of the details. If it was something more minor, I can tell you what I've seen. Now, what I've learned in working in the courts is it really depends on what investigators get a hold of this, what attorneys are the ones looking at it in the beginning that will determine how far it goes along that process. But there are some who say, if they are if it is their first offense, there is more leniency given to that, as well as if it was a minor offense. So if it was just a touching or an exposure, something like that, then it's looked at as more of a boundary issue that needs to be addressed with this person. And I imagine they would try to treat that as a youth with problematic sexual behaviors. And so I didn't really go far into that that group, but even in Harris County, we have one of the we have a program. It's called the BASE program through the DA's office, and there aren't many like it that I'm aware of. But what they're doing is when there is a youth who acts out on another youth, and in the case of someone with special needs or disabilities, developmental disabilities, they would be viewed as one of these youth with problematic sexual behaviors. What they do is if they fit a certain eligibility requirement, such as no penetration, no violence that was involved in it, there may be a few other criteria, but if they fit within that criteria, they will refer them to the BASE program. And it's more of a curriculum-based treatment. And if they complete that, then they will drop all charges and just be done with it. And that is their attempt to, it's almost like a diversion program to keep them from having anything on their record. But if they don't complete that, or if they continue to offend, then it will go, they'll bypass that program and they will go towards charges. But I think it really depends on if they've done this before, how much coercion or violence was involved, and also the act that was engaged in. That will determine that. But there are people looking at that though, and there are people on this committee, I guess you could say, or on this, they're part of this program, that are therapists and they're well informed. And so they are part of the decision making when it comes to what to do with these individuals and how to address them and how to treat them. Now that is in Harris County. I cannot say what other counties are doing elsewhere, but Harris County, believe it or not, is very progressive in how they view the victims and perpetrators and how they want to protect their people. So they're kind of ahead of the game and compared to most other places. But it's a great question. And I'm glad that we are looking at that because, you know, they do deserve some time to learn and to be redirected, I guess you could say, if they are struggling with boundaries due to special needs. But great question. Anything else?
There was one other question. The Jeffrey said you may be getting to this, so in case that's coming up, do you have any statistics on socioeconomic status and child sexual abuse statistics?
So I don't know. I don't know that I included that in this one because if I get to it, I get to it, but I don't know that I included that in this one. What I learned in even preparing for this presentation that I thought was going to be a very simple to put together presentation ended up being not a very simple presentation to put together, is because statistics, as we learn more, statistics become less reliable because we are learning that what we relied on is not, there's no consensus across fields who are looking at these numbers. And so it's hard to say what statistics are accurate because of that lack of consensus, which is why it is so important we come up with a definition that we can all kind of go by. But I can tell you from my experience, there is no socioeconomic class that is not, or that is immune from this. Even trafficking. I've had some victims who were trafficked in the nicest parts of Harris County, in the wealthiest parts of Harris County. And so there is no, I don't know how you would actually get those statistics. If you think about it, the higher SES you are, the less likely you will be allowed to talk about it. I mean, if you look at even celebrities, they settle out of court all the time. They don't want people talking about it. They don't want attention being drawn to it. And so even if this is happening in these different classes, you're going to have some that are, you're going to have a deflated number, just given the stigma that comes with reporting this kind of abuse. And so we do see it across all classes, but I don't have actual statistics for that. I couldn't find them, to be honest with you. That's why the most recent statistic as far as reporting in general is from 2020. And if you're to read that article, it's from even earlier than that. And I don't know if y'all are familiar with Finkelhor. I don't know his first name, but the researcher Finkelhor, he's all about statistics, and he is really urging that we put a pause on reporting statistics because we're not including everyone that should be included. And so I got that number from his work. And even this next slide is from his work. And he's talking about how we should not talk about sexual abuse without also including online abuse, because so much research ignores this abuse. And so what he has found is when you add this component, when you add the online piece, you get even higher rates. I think they increase by like 50%, the statistics. And so, and I didn't even put the statistics on here for this one because he warns about it, I did put a small graph on the next one, but yeah, so to determine how often it is actually happening is impossible because we don't know when people are not reporting. And then in addition to that, knowing those among different classes is very difficult. Just knowing the pressure to suppress and to maintain surface level, um, just I guess this perception of perfection in the more elite classes. And so, no, I don't have those numbers, but if you can find them, I would love to have you email those to me because I can't find them. I ended up working so many more hours on this than I ever planned just because of the new research that's coming out. But it was very informative. I did learn about all this and these new concerns just preparing for this presentation. So, but a little bit on online child sexual abuse and exploitation. So while technology has created new forms of child sexual abuse, it hasn't necessarily, according to some research, really increased the number. It has changed the way that abuse is being sought out, but numbers have not necessarily risen because of online child sexual abuse. But we do have these different concepts that come from the online child sexual abuse, and that is online grooming. So this is online communication that's used to lure and coerce minors into a sexual relationship. I see this frequently in clients. I always try to ask if you've videoed with these people, do you know how old they are? But their lives are online. And so oftentimes this is the grooming that happens online happens at a much more rapid pace than the grooming that happens in real life. Once you request a friend, y'all are friends. And now all of a sudden you have this sense of trust, and it's simply based on nothing. But that's what they do. They see that they have a friend now online, and now they're friends, and they talk and they trust this person. So online grooming is a big problem, and it is very rapid. It's rapidly achieved. So image-based sexual abuse. This is when sexual images are taken, made, or shared without consent. This is even when kids might take them on their own. It's not, there's no consent to share them. So this would also qualify under image-based sexual abuse anytime these images are taken, made, or shared without consent. Then you have the non-consensual sexting. Sexual images shared without consent. There is a new law in the past, I want to say 5 or so years, where essentially you cannot just share explicit photos of yourself without the other person requesting them, or it's basically like indecent exposure. You can be charged with that. You can be charged with sending a naked photo that was not asked for. Which is nice because, you know, and that makes sense. In real life, people aren't allowed to just come up and show you their genitals. They shouldn't be allowed to just send it to you on your phone either. And so it's like the online version of exposure, indecent exposure. Sextortion. This is extortion of money or sexual images using the threat of disseminating the obtained images. So what I have found, and what I've been to a seminar on this where they talked about young boys being the ones that are mostly victims of this, like teenage boys being victims of this, thinking that they are talking to a teenage girl, and they share explicit photos of them. Then these people who are actually in charge of the other account let them know they've just been had, and now I have your images. I will send them to your parents. I will send them to your schools. I will send them everywhere if you not send me more of them. And so that's sextortion. So they are using these, they're obtaining images consensually, but then exploiting the situation. And oftentimes if they don't get more, they're usually asking for money. They're asking for gift cards. They're asking for money to be sent through different apps with extorting the photos that they've received. But it's really a money-making scheme, and it's a huge industry. A lot of the ones that are perpetrating this are actually in other countries. But it's almost like the FBI was actually giving the seminar, and they said that it's almost impossible to catch these people. So the best way to to approach this issue is by addressing it with kids, and also putting curfews on phone limits or phone usage. And they said that the majority of these occur at night, whenever the children have gone to bed, or teenagers have gone to bed, they have their phones, they're alone. And this is when most of that sextortion occurs, is during that time. There's actually, in California, there's been an uptick in male teen suicides rate because of sextortion. It's a very new and very big problem. Then you have online commercial sexual exploitation. So this is the exchange of sexual images or interactions online for money or other valuables. So that's usually those who are they're both in it together, almost like saying, I'll give you this photo for that type of photo, or just exchanging these photos that they've obtained illegally and selling them, or selling them for money or whatever. And so we see this a lot too with the community online of, I guess you would say, like the online, like the dark web. Whenever you're in a community of people who are sex abusers or those who are into child sexual images, if they join this group, in order to remain in this group, you must earn your trust. Earning trust is by taking brand new photos of children and providing them. Not finding something on the web that you can just give. You have to actually create new images and provide them to the group. It's almost your dues, I guess you could say. And so then they can make money off of selling those from that point on too. So it's a very large industry, unfortunately. But again, we could talk for hours on all of that. But the FBI is in trying, they're trying to search for ways to deal with this, but they say really it all starts with the parents in the home talking to their children, letting them know not to fall prey to this kind of thing, and to just to say something when something like this happens. But anyone have any questions or thoughts on that? I know it's kind of like a new field that isn't talked much about.
I don't see any other questions at the moment.
Okay. So this is the graph I was talking about. So Finkelhor, the one I mentioned earlier, the one that talked about the online sexual abuse. These are some of the statistics he put together. So with males, when you ask about generic abuse, you see that's in the blue. That's actually the smaller number. When you add online, it raises from 6.2 to 7.6. Then you have a total of 10.8. But then with females, 19.8 with the regular research surveys and that kind of thing that do not include online, you get 19%. Then when you ask about online, and I'm sorry, I think I said that wrong a second ago. This is just the blue is separate from the generic, is separate from the online. And then when you look at the composite of it mixed, of it blended, you get the composite score. So because some of those who reported generic abuse, when you ask about online abuse, they add to it. And so then you get the higher number. And so it raises then to the third number. Then you have other gender, they didn't specify whether they were male or female. Specifically, you have the generic abuse at 35%, online at 19%, and it gives you a composite of 41%. So the point of that was when you add the online abuse to the generic abuse, the total raises almost 50%. And so it is important that we look at the online abuse because, I mean, kids these days, they're born with phones in their hands. They're born with the internet. And most parents are unable to find it within them to limit that access. And so, and it's also difficult to limit that access when schools require kids to have laptops. They require them to do work online. And so it's really difficult, but to get them away from the online world. And so it's really important to talk about that aspect as well. And also for those of you who work with kids and families, it is important to also remind parents that they do not know all that their children are doing. They do not know all that they are looking at. And they do not need to use the excuse, well, my daughter wouldn't do that, or my son wouldn't do that, or look at that, because they absolutely would. And so they need to have more prevention measures, or if it's to the point where their child has been victimized, to have measures where they can help treat it, or approach it in a way that's not going to be more shameful or anything like that. But yeah, so it's important to not only look at the type of sexual abuse that we've all learned about, but also the online abuse as well. Okay. So detecting and disclosing sexual abuse. So disclosure is a process. It is sometimes a very complicated process. It is a lifelong process. It is not a one-time event. And it is also not as easy or simple or straightforward as many people would like to assume. So there are I talk about this a lot in court, because there's most of the time you're going to have a delayed disclosure, a disclosure that happens long after the abuse began. For some reasons are the child is too young. Maybe the child is abused at an age that's pre-toddler, so they don't have a voice yet. They don't have words. They don't have that language development to be able to disclose. Then if they do have language, oftentimes they don't have the vocabulary to disclose what's happened to them. They don't know how to articulate it because it's something so unfamiliar to them. They don't understand it. And they also have to be able to understand what's happening to them. So these three factors, the language development, vocabulary, and understanding, really do play a significant role in the delay of disclosure. And in them even being aware that what is happening to them is abuse or wrong. And so we need to look at that. Oftentimes kids will just say, I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't know how to talk about it. And so they just didn't. And they just hoped that someone would find out. But then when they are able to communicate it, they need to have the expectation that whoever they're going to tell is going to believe them and support them and intervene on their behalf. There have been many studies on this. Oftentimes children believe that they're going to be blamed for the abuse. They're not going to be believed. Oftentimes they just don't feel like that the consequences are going to be, the consequences are going to outweigh the benefits, because they don't know what the consequences will be. They expect sometimes that it's going to break up the family. They don't want to be responsible for that. There's so many different factors that go into not only detecting the abuse, but also disclosing it, being able to disclose it. Then you have the intentional versus unintentional disclosures. You might hear some people say intentional versus accidental disclosure. That just doesn't seem to fit with me. But the unintentional disclosure is, let's say someone has walked in on the abuse. It is now out there. It's been exposed. It's been discovered. And now the child is pressured to talk about what happened. This is an unintentional disclosure because the child did not intend on anyone finding out, but it was just accidentally discovered. This also happens with diaries. Sometimes people will find a diary that the child has written in about the abuse, and now they're pressuring the child to talk about it. Or you may have a pregnancy. I've literally watched a 12-year-old who is pregnant sit in a forensic interview and swear that no one has ever touched her and nothing has ever happened, and she's pregnant. And so there's so much resistance to talking about this very thing. And also it's talking about people that they know and love, because remember, 90 to 95% of the time, some loved family friend or family member is the one responsible for this. And so there's a lot of conflict as far as the child talking about it. But it is also very important that when there is a disclosure, uh, the child is ready to talk about it and they move at their own pace. If they are forced to talk about it, pressured to talk about it before they're ready, then that could actually add to their sense of violation. It can add to their sense of exposure, unwanted exposure. It can compound their sense of trauma. It can even lead to them saying it didn't happen and just denying it because they just don't want to talk about it anymore. They're not ready to talk about it. And so it is very important that we don't pressure them if they're not ready, because it's only going to lead, or it potentially could lead to a denial, which will then be problematic if they later on say something did happen. So it's just as far as legal issues anyway. You want to give them that space to talk about it, but also allow them to kind of do that on their own time. Okay. All right. So disclosure, there are facilitators of disclosure and barriers to disclosure. Historically, barriers to disclosure have been the most talked about. Then there was some meta-analysis that came out, I believe in 2020, that said we also need to talk about facilitators, because oftentimes children just don't have those facilitators that will assist them. And so this is a little bit of what I touched on a minute ago, with language development, vocabulary to articulate it, the understanding that it was wrong or abusive, and then having a trusted adult who they expect will believe them and support them. And then also another facilitator is being prompted by something. I've had clients tell me that they never said anything because no one asked them, or they didn't say anything sooner because no one asked them. I've had clients come to me who's had therapy before, they never talked about it. And I would ask, what stopped you from talking about it with your first therapist? And they would say, literally, one has said to me, she wasn't ready to hear it. I'm like, okay, well, how do you know she wasn't ready to hear it? Well, she never asked me about it. And so they just sometimes need that prompting to know that you're ready to hear it. And so asking them is important. Has anything ever happened to you? And if they say no, they say no. Not pressuring them, but it's okay to ask. Also, another facilitator is a need to tell. So if they are unable to cope with it on their own any longer, it might come out unexpectedly. So we know sexual abuse tends to happen in isolation, and kids will tend to cope with it in isolation as well. So, but we all have our own limits to coping and to being able to manage something effectively. Kids have even a smaller tolerance for that. And so their ability to cope is going to extinguish much more quickly than an adult's would usually. So you might start to see them acting out in certain ways because they just don't know how to articulate what they're feeling or what they're going through. And so it comes out in their behaviors. And then sometimes it'll just come out for what seems to be no reason, but really it's them dealing with it for so long that it finally just comes out almost like a pressure cooker. I've had some who they were fighting about doing her chores or putting her clothes away. And just that small argument was all it took for her to finally just say, well, do you know what happened to me? And it just comes out. But that's one of those need to tells. Like, I just cannot hold this any longer because I cannot cope with anything else in my life with hanging on to this secret. And so those are facilitators of disclosure. Then you have the barriers to disclosure. Some of them go hand in hand. So obviously, hand in hand with facilitators. Obviously, if you don't have the language, the vocabulary, or the understanding, those are barriers. But also the fear of not being believed, the fear of being blamed, the fear of consequences. And there are many consequences to telling. Consequences could be the separation of your family. It could be losing the relationship that you have with this person. Oftentimes they're really trying to preserve the relationship. So they love this person. They just want the abuse to stop. And so they'll withhold for a while. They might not want the person to go to jail they don't want to hurt that person, or they don't want to hurt the non-offending caregiver. They may say, well, this is the first good relationship my mother has had in a long time. The others were abusive to her. He's great to her, so I don't want to ruin that relationship. Sometimes you'll even have them say, I don't want my little siblings to grow up without a parent. But these kids are often wrestling with so many different perceived consequences that they delay the disclosure. And also you have this emotional component where they feel guilt. They feel like they're to blame. They don't want the exposure or the embarrassment. And shame is usually an underlying theme in most of these cases for everyone involved. But those are some barriers to disclosure. So, you'll hear people say, well, why didn't they just tell someone? Well, there are so many factors that play into that, to the answer to that. And what I try to tell people too is they may not realize they're doing this, but really they're weighing the pros and the cons. And if the cost of telling outweighs the benefit of telling, they're less likely to tell. And they might not be able to articulate it that way, but that's essentially what's happening. Okay, and so these are just some other factors that was found in some other research. So like the age of the victim. So the younger the child is, especially their developmental level, that could affect disclosure or their ability to disclose. Males. So males are less likely to disclose. That's for a few reasons. The social stigma involved in that is a large factor, particularly if the perpetrator is a female. Men and boys are taught to feel proud of how many people they've slept with. So this is for them to say that they were a non-consenting party to this, can make them feel emasculated and weak, for lack of a better word. But it's a struggle for them. They don't want to appear weak. They don't want to appear like a guy who couldn't handle it, and so they keep it to themselves. If the perpetrator is male, it's a struggle for them, because oftentimes when they are abused, males, as opposed to females, their bodies betray them in a way. So if they get an erection, even if they don't want this to happen, their bodies are responding in a way that is biologically healthy, the way a body is meant to respond. But they sometimes see that as, does this make me gay, or did I want this, or what have you. And the perpetrator can also use that as a way of saying, well, if you didn't want it, you wouldn't have become erect, and just really manipulative. Whereas you and I know that that's just a biological reaction, but it can really, really affect the child's, I guess, just ability and the desire to come forward because of that stigma. So the relationship to the perpetrator, the closer the child is to their perpetrator, the longer it will be for them to come forward, according to research. The closer they are, the more they want to protect that person, the more they love that person and just want that person to stop abusing them, but they want to still preserve the relationship. And so that plays a role. And then the frequency and severity of the abuse also can play a role. And all of those lead to longer delays, typically. It's not 100% across the board, but that is typically other factors that will delay the disclosure even longer. Okay. So I think I might have mentioned this just now, but so themes that influence male disclosure: fear of being labeled a homosexual. The body betrayal could cause them to question their own sexuality. Fear of being stigmatized or isolated. We find this in some families. The isolation is pretty significant. Fear of continuing the cycle of abuse. So it's extremely important to know that just because someone is a victim of sexual abuse does not mean they're going to go on and become sexual abusers. That is a myth, and it does a disservice to all of those survivors who do not even consider abusing other people. But because of this stereotype, this does lead to that fear of becoming an abuser, and then subsequently their tendency to withhold that disclosure because they don't want to be labeled as that. Okay, any questions about anything we've talked about so far, or comments? And then I'm going to move on to the offenders.
There are just two quick questions. You may have hit on this, but how prevalent is sextortion in our area?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know.
Hmm.
I don't know how much it is in our area. I was in California at a week-long seminar, so they were talking more about the California statistics, but it is a nationwide problem because this is one of those international, heavily international crimes. It still happens domestically, but a lot of what they see are people from other countries doing this. But and it's a very organized crime. They have different people who are the ones, I guess, like baiting the teens, and then once they get the photos, they send it to the next person who then does the sextortion, and then they send it to the next person who receives the gift cards. And I mean, it's a very organized system they've got going on. But to answer your question, no, I don't know what the statistics are here in Texas, but good question. I could look into that.
And there was just one follow-up sort of to that. Are there any reported incidences of live streaming child sexual abuse, CSA?
Like, are you asking if it occurs?
I think that's what the person is asking, if it has ever occurred.
Yes, that does occur. I don't know the numbers on that, but yes, I've had clients who it's really kind of egregious. I'll just tell you. But like there's these like rings, right? That you have like these groups of people who are into this, and they will teach their children that this is part of what daddies and daughters do, right? Or whatever the relationship may be. And kids, I've actually had one in therapy with me who had a fan base and did not realize that this was wrong because she was taught this is normal. But it was a live stream. She would do videos. She had a fan base of men who would watch her do things, and she was a child. So it does occur. How often it occurs, I can't tell you that. I don't know that, but yes, it absolutely occurs. And now, and that was, gosh, that was probably 10 years ago when I had that one specific client. So I'm sure it's only gotten more prolific now, but because that was before TikTok and all of that kind of thing. But yeah, so I don't know what the numbers would be, but that it certainly does happen. I've even seen it. I don't know if any of you want to hear this, but I've even seen it with infants and toddlers, where it is live streaming abuse, and it's pretty sick stuff, but it does happen. So, did you say there was another question?
Yes, I was just taking a deep breath. Someone had a comment about a story about sextortion. And then another question was, where would Dr. Krausen recommend professionals to seek certifications or CEUs to work better with this population of kids or adults?
Oh, well, this is a good start. Our facility actually, gosh, I don't know, we put on so many trainings a year. I couldn't even tell you how many there are, but I would say just seeking out trainings at different advocacy centers. There's in Houston, you have the CAC where we are. You also have the DePelchin Center. Those we are probably the ones that are doing more of the trainings in that area. Then you have CACs of Texas. It's CACTX dot something. But CACs of Texas, they're basically they manage all the CACs within Texas. And I'm sure they have plenty of trainings. I know we go to trainings with them all the time. But it would also depend on if you're looking more for working with families versus treating traumatized children, um, more prevention efforts on the front end. If that's what you're looking for, prevention efforts to teach families how to look for this, then you have the NECMEC, that is the uh, something for exploited children, and I'll have to get back. NECMEC is the acronym. But I'll have to give that back to you on that. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on that one right now. But they do a fantastic training on online grooming and online perpetrating, and how to teach your children how to be safe online, and that kind of thing. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. That's it. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NECMEC. They do a fantastic job of, they even, like, parents and their children can go to these trainings, and they'll split them up, and the parents will go through a training on how to safeguard their devices, how to talk to their children about certain things, and then the children will learn about the dangers and the risks that are involved and how easy it can happen, and it just helps them to learn what's out there too. And so they're great for working on the front end to prevent this kind of thing from happening with families. But that's an option too. I don't know if that answered your question. If it did not, then you can always, after this presentation sometime, you can email me or call me, and we can talk more about what you're looking for specifically. But there are a lot of different options for being trained. It just really depends on what type of training, what level of training, and for what purpose. But great question though. And good to know that people want to be trained in this kind of stuff. Not everybody, it's not for everyone. Not everybody wants to deal with this area, but. Okay, was that it? Or is there another question?
No other questions that I can see right now.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to offenders. Okay, so offenders. Who are they? What do they look like? Why do they do what they do? Okay, so first of all, we do have some offenders who would not meet the diagnostic criteria for pedophilic disorder. Now, I include this though. This is from our diagnostic manual for mental health disorders. And this is kind of where the idea, I mentioned it way in the beginning about the age definition of, or the construct of age when defining child sexual abuse, of someone who is 5 years or more older than the victim. That's where this is where that comes from. So for a pedophilic disorder, a person must have recurrent, intense sexually arousing fantasies or urges, or behaviors involving sexual activity with a prepubescent child or children. Now, if you pay attention to the "or," this does not mean they have to have ever acted on it. They could just have these fantasies or urges. If they've acted on it, it most certainly like fits that criteria, but they don't have to act on it to fit the criteria. Then you have the individual has acted on these sexual urges, or these sexual urges or fantasies cause marked distress or interpersonal difficulty. So if they have not acted on it, these urges have to have caused distress in the person. It really bothers them. Or it interferes with their ability to have interpersonal relationships or function well in all areas. The person must be at least 16 years old and at least 5 years older than the child or children they fantasize about. So you would not include an individual in late adolescence involved in an ongoing sexual relationship with a 12 or 13-year-old, despite what your views are on whether or not that should happen. In order to fit this disorder, those cannot be involved. Specify whether it's exclusive or non-exclusive type. So are they only attracted to children, or they're attracted to both children and adults? And also specify if they are attracted to males, females, or both, or if it's just limited to incest as well. So this is more diagnostic. I don't know how many of you are in the field of diagnosing, but I put this in here just for those of you who are. This is how you would define a pedophile. Now, just because someone sexually abuses children does not make them a pedophile. They could be an opportunist. They could just be someone who doesn't care about, they have no empathy for others, and they just seek to gratify their own urges, and so this might not fit them. But this is for those who have an actual orientation toward children. Okay. All right, so what do they look like? Unfortunately, you cannot pick them out of a crowd because they look like you and me. They fit in very easily. They can and they do exhibit socially appropriate behaviors. They exist within our socially appropriate norms. And so, unfortunately, we cannot, there's no profile for what a perpetrator looks like. I think believing in that is what gets us into the trouble of not believing the kids, because we think, oh, well, this person couldn't have done it. They're just so wonderful. And so we need to abandon that ideology and accept the fact that they could be a person sitting next to you. This is why we so often befriend these people. We sometimes marry them. We put them at the head of children's charities because we trust them and they appear to be trustworthy. And so we do not know what they look like. They look like you and me. Now, what we do know is that they are usually male, but there are also female perpetrators. Society still has a hard time seeing females as perpetrators. And so I've seen cases where there was the exact same age difference in a male and female perpetrator from their victim, and no one wanted to hold the female accountable and everyone wanted to hold the male accountable. It's just the way society is. And so, but that in no way means it is right. Female perpetrators are just as wrong, and they are just as criminal. But that's one reason that we have lower numbers of female perpetrators, is because they just aren't seen to be perpetrators. There's also, perpetrators are also driven by a need for power, dominance, control. They have an impaired capacity for intimacy, especially when it is age appropriate intimacy. They may have problems with their partners who they're in a marriage with, but they easily perpetrate on their children. And that's just because they have an impaired ability to navigate those age appropriate relationships. Usually, also, they usually have a low self-esteem. They may have interpersonal insensitivities. You might not recognize that. They might put on a good front, but when you talk to them, oftentimes they do have these insecurities, which then lead them to feel more in control and more comfortable when they hold the power differential in the relationship. Okay. All right. So myths, these are myths. So as I'm talking about this, remember that they're myths. So most offenders have many victims beginning in childhood. That is not the case. That is not true. Most sex offenders are strangers. While we do want to still teach our children about stranger danger, we also need to teach them about the danger in our homes as well, and with those close to us. Sex offenders have a profile or look a certain way. That's a myth. Most sex offenders were sexually abused during childhood. That is also a myth. It's what they call the vampire syndrome, meaning that it's the idea that once you are bitten, you are then destined to become a vampire yourself. I included the fact on this page because I want it to be clear that this is not true. So the fact, this is false. It's very disrespectful to survivors of sexual abuse, and it's a disservice to them. So, so we need to, anytime you hear that the idea that someone must have been sexually abused as a child because they're sexually abusing now, it would be nice for you and society to correct that idea. So now on the flip side of that, the facts. So while offenders may start offending at an early age, they tend to have very few victims until adulthood due to this intrapsychic or internal conflict. They know that it's wrong, and so they try to steer clear of it. But oftentimes they go through this cycle of like of self-talk and desensitization, to where they talk themselves into doing just a little bit, but not too much. But then over time, that little bit becomes a little bit more, and it becomes a little bit more, and it becomes a little bit more, until eventually they have crossed a line that they didn't even think they would cross. But it has taken a while for them to get there. So over time, the defense mechanisms assist in slowly moving them toward achieving their ultimate fantasy. Depends on many factors, two of the most important being their moral inhibitors and their access to children. Like I said earlier, adults don't have just free access to children, and so they'd have to gain that access somehow. Also, adolescent offenders typically do not continue to exhibit sexually predatory behaviors in adulthood, which is why we have those programs now for the youth with problematic sexual behaviors. We recognize this, and so we try to just divert the behavior and help them. And then again, the idea that one has been sexually abused as a child will lead them to become a sexual abuser. That's not right. In fact, a study by White and Massey found that individuals with histories of childhood physical abuse or severe neglect, they are the ones who are at significantly increased risk for committing sexual offenses as an adult. And that is because of the way the brain develops. If a child does not have proper attachment or healthy relationships with adults, the part of their brain that understands empathy is not formed appropriately. And so they go on to have a lack of empathy later on, and they just work to fulfill their own needs. And so physical abuse and severe neglect, those are the ones that that actually have more of a risk for becoming a perpetrator of abuse, of sexual abuse. Okay. All right, so grooming. Grooming in this respect is the process by which a perpetrator will gain access to a victim, maintain that access, and reduce the chances of disclosure. And if there is a disclosure, reduce the chance that they'll be believed. It is common for people to think that grooming only includes gift giving or treating a child special, but there's so much more involved in that. Grooming occurs at the outset of these situations. So again, if a perpetrator, if adults don't have just free access to children, they must gain that access, right? So if they're doing that, they have to first groom the adult who will give them that access. And so grooming tends to begin earlier on than ever meeting the child. It tends to begin with the adults and those around the child. It increases confusion for all of those involved because they believe this person to be reliable, trustworthy, and it also increases cooperation by the child if the grooming is done effectively. It increases secrecy and reduces this chance of resistance. It reduces the child's credibility if the grooming is done really well. And I think I go into different types of grooming on the next slide, but also I wanted to make the point too, grooming is used on not only the child, but those that are closest to the child, and also the community at large. So it helps to fill family roles, or the perpetrator may help to fill family roles. They may provide support via financial, emotional, or some other type of support. They are, and they most oftentimes are, socially involved with other people. They may be a charismatic leader, but they can really engage with others in a way that establishes trust and establishes this air of reliability and dependency on this person. And in doing so, they are more likely to get away with what they're doing. Let's see. Okay, so the grooming process. All right, so there are different types of grooming, like I mentioned. So there is the one that is talked about the most in society, which is building this, establishing a trusting relationship with the treating them special, buying them gifts, it lowers their guard. It increases their trust in the person, their cooperation with the person. And it can also be viewed as these subtle violations of appropriate behavior, but they have subtle violations that can like systematically then transition to inappropriate behaviors in a way where the child doesn't always recognize it as a violation, maybe until it's in their view too late. There's encouraging secrecy, so telling the child this is a secret just between you and me. No one else has to know about it. It's special. Then you have isolating the child. So isolating the child serves a few purposes. One, it prevents the child from having an opportunity to tell anyone. It also prevents the child from knowing or experiencing healthy relationships. In order to understand an unhealthy relationship, one must know what healthy relationships look and feel like. And so by keeping the child outside of other people's homes, they can't recognize when something in their own home is off. I've had plenty of clients who have come through and said, well, I just thought this is how people loved each other. I thought this is how families acted, but they were never around other families to see that that wasn't true. And so isolation serves that purpose. It can also serve the purpose of like always the perpetrator always having control over what the child says and does by always being an observer. So isolation is usually a big role. Tending to the child's unmet needs, again, similar to the adult's needs, filling a role, a significant family role, being there for emotional support, social support, doing things for them that maybe their other parent wouldn't let them do, so they seem to be on their side, things like that. You have normalization and rationalization. These can kind of go hand in hand. It's when the perpetrator will coerce a child into inappropriate behaviors by trying to convince them that they are appropriate and normal. This could be using pornography to teach the child about relationships, when that's obviously a crime in and of itself to show them pornography, but it could also be a way to prove that this is something they should enjoy. I've seen plenty of times where they showed the child pornography and said, you see, they enjoy it, you should enjoy it too. It's something that everyone should enjoy. That kind of thing is normalization, rationalization. Then you have intimidation and threats. Now, intimidation and threats can be both implied and they can be explicitly stated. So obviously the ones that are explicitly stated are, for example, if you tell someone, I will kill your mom. If you tell someone, you're going to be in trouble. If you tell someone, I'll shoot myself, things like that. Then you have the implied intimidation and threats. So if you have someone who engages in domestic violence in the home, or they're very aggressive towards other people, then the child views that as something that could possibly happen to them if they were to let out this secret. So the threats don't have to be explicitly stated to the child in order for the threat to be felt, or the intimidation to be felt. Let's see, any questions about grooming? Okay. So then we have vulnerabilities in children. So while anyone can be a target of abuse, there are some vulnerabilities that make children more likely to be abused than others. So a child who is unhappy, lonely, kicking rocks as they walk home from school, like that is going to be a perfect target for a perpetrator to come in and be a friend to this child, to rescue them in a sense, to be this savior, especially if they lack healthy adult relationships. This often is the case in single parent homes where the single parent is trying to work extra hours to make ends meet. There's not a lot of supervision. And so the perpetrator can come in, assist with that, be the babysitter, the taxi driver, whatever they need to be for the other parent, that really just helps take the load off. Could also be parental substance abuse is oftentimes a factor that makes children more vulnerable. Multiple non-familial caretakers, due to either a single parent home or the foster care system. This can be for a number of reasons as well, but it's just more opportunity for an adult to exploit the situation, to see that the child has unmet needs, and take advantage of that. So a child who is engaging in acting out behaviors is also a very good target, because they're the easiest ones to blame for what's happened, or to say they're just lying, they lie about everything, don't you know how they act? That's how the perpetrator could respond if there's ever disclosure, and it makes the child less credible because they have this history of acting out. So those are targets too. Prior history of abuse, particularly if the perpetrator is aware of that. They use this sometimes to say, well, they just disclose about everybody. That's not true in this case, but they can use that history of abuse to finagle their way out of it. Sexual ignorance or naivety, I can go on for hours about that one. I think it is very important for children to be aware and educated on sexual development, healthy sexual development, healthy sexual practices. And if that is against your views or your values, understood. But if you are not the one teaching them this, they will learn it from somewhere. They will Google it, they will YouTube it, they will ask the person in the alley, whoever they need to ask to find the answers to this information. And if parents want their views and their values to be instilled in their children, they need to be the first ones talking about it. And so I have had so many kids and even parents tell me that they learned about abuse as they were or they learned about sex as they were being raped. They had no idea what sex even was. It was all very, very brand new to them. And so it's just really important to talk to children about this, because if they have an education about sex and sexuality, they can make educated decisions about it. Children with a disability. So these children are 3 to 8 times more likely to experience child sexual abuse than their non-disabled peers. This is from the Darkness to Light website. And obviously, children with disabilities are more easily manipulated, and just more easy to get them to cooperate with you. Also, sexual orientation concerns. So children who identify as LGB are 4 times more likely to report child sexual abuse than heterosexual peers. This is also including those who've been raped by those who were younger as well. So like raped by other youth for being gay, usually. 1 in 4 transgender youth experience child sexual abuse by age 18. And again, this is from the Darkness to Light website. And it goes into a little bit more detail on that website, but I didn't have the space to do that on this one. But all that to say, those who are in a sexual minority, it is very important that they feel supported by those around them. It's important that they feel that they can talk to people about their orientation, their sexuality, and to feel more confident in who they are, so that they are not taken by surprise or as vulnerable to these types of perpetrators. Okay. Characteristics and vulnerabilities of non-offending caregivers. So I know when I first started working in this field, I thought for sure that all children are believed when they disclose sexual abuse, and that is just simply not the case. And it is also not the case that they are believed by their non-offending caregivers. And it took me some time to understand that, and to really empathize with the non-offending caregivers that have a hard time believing, but it makes sense to me now, and I have some compassion for them. If I've kind of come up with the example of if someone were to go to a non-offending caregiver and say, your child is being sexually abused by your partner. If their initial reaction to that was, oh, yeah, okay, I can see that. That is much more disturbing because they have an idea that this person could be doing that. That is much more disturbing than the disbelief that no, never, not this person, because I trust this person, I love this person. I would never put my child around a person like that. And so for them to have the disbelief in the beginning, now hopefully not out loud to the child, but to have that disbelief is healthy. Otherwise, they were knowingly putting their child around someone who would do something like this. So, and even working in this field for 11 years, knowing that children rarely make false allegations of child sexual abuse, I would even have a hard time if someone were to make an allegation against someone in my family. That would be hard to believe. And I've worked in this field for so long. Now, I would still believe the child, but it would be difficult. And that's because I trust them and I think that I can rely on them and depend on them. And so it's helped me to really have some compassion and empathy for these non-offending caregivers. But sometimes they're in these situations because they may be, and they might have a hard time believing because they may be financially dependent on the perpetrator. They may not have any other options. If they were to believe these allegations, that means their financial support is gone. They have to move out of the home. They're desolate. They have all these other very basic, understandable needs and concerns to think about. Then they also may have been in abusive relationships before, where the perpetrator was violent toward the non-offending caregiver, but now in this new relationship, they treat the non-offending caregiver great. The abuse is only toward the child, and so it's hard for that non-offending caregiver to believe the abuse is happening because they seem like such a perfect person compared to previous relationships. So that goes into the next point of the perpetrator, maybe the first partner who was not physically abusive. Also, the higher preponderance of women who have been sexually abused as children are also some of these who are engaged in relationships with people who are perpetrating against their children. So them being abused as children. So the reason that one of the reasons they might fall victim to this type of relationship is because they think, or have a hard time believing the child is because they think, well, I was sexually abused as a child and they're not acting the way I acted. So surely it's not real. So they can't be telling the truth. And so oftentimes they will think, well, if they didn't act the way I acted, then it can't be true. So, and then some of them may struggle with immediate acceptance of the child's outcry. Like I said, we kind of hope there's an initial struggle, initial disbelief, because otherwise, why are you around this person? There needs to be some sort of disbelief, but not out loud in front of the child. There needs to always be belief in front of the child. Okay. So signs and symptoms and behaviors that may indicate possible sexual abuse. So pain when using the toilet, repeated genital infections, cuts or bruising in the genital area, frequent masturbation. And this is whether or not your values or your beliefs are that children should be masturbating. It is a natural behavior. However, at a very young age, it is not as normative. They don't really know what that means. But once they become of the age of masturbation, or once they are exposed to it. Now, if they are prematurely exposed to it, you may see it happening at an age where you think, oh, it's kind of young for them to be doing that. But normally with kids, if you redirect the behavior to, you can't do that out in the living room, that needs to be something you do by yourself in your bedroom. Naturally, for normally developing children, that will be all you need to do. Redirect it and they'll be redirected. However, if you try to redirect it and they continue to masturbate very frequently in the living, in public spaces, or even to the point where they're hurting themselves, that is problematic. That's something you definitely need to look into. They try to dress provocatively, or they have provocative behavior with adults or other kids that is beyond what is expected of that age. Frequent sexual play with friends, toys, or pets, and does not respond to redirection again. So again, there is a developmental stage where they're being curious, and they're learning that other people have different parts. But if you just redirect that behavior and say that's not what we do, usually that is all a child needs. But if they are continuing to do it over and over and they have this hyper focus on it, that's where it's more problematic, and you want to be more aware of that and look into that. And then you have these behavioral regressions. So for example, they've been potty trained for a while and out of nowhere, they start wetting the bed. They change from this very autonomous, independent child to a very needy, clingy child, or vice versa. Insists on sleeping in their parents' bed when they used to never have a problem sleeping in their own bed. These are certain behaviors that you would want to look into. Now, you should not see one of these and just assume sexual abuse. That is not what I am implying. You need to, like, these are just a list of behaviors. If you were to see a few of these, you would want to look more into it specifically regarding sexual abuse. But other things could just be medical, like the pain when using the toilet, genital infections. That could also be a medical issue that you want to get checked out before assuming that there's any sexual abuse happening. Okay. All right. So now you have signs and symptoms of or behaviors of trauma. So abuse is different from trauma, to be clear. Sometimes these terms are used interchangeably, and they are not the same thing. Abuse can be occurring without trauma. Trauma is a perceived event, so or perception of an event. So this is especially true for those who are younger, who are taught this is the way you show affection. It's taught that this is how you love each other. So they might be getting sexually abused, but to them, it's not traumatic yet because they recognize it as only good things. And so it's not until they are taken out of the situation, they become a little bit more aware and more mature, and they start to realize what those behaviors meant, how they were violations, things of that nature. And then you might start to see trauma symptoms start to come up, but it's a delayed response because they did not feel the trauma when it was actually happening. But some signs or symptoms or behaviors that you may expect to see when there is a perceived trauma is they're separated into 4 different areas of functioning. So you have intrusion, intrusive thoughts, or another way of saying unwanted thoughts. These thoughts are unwanted because they cause physiological and psychological distress. They might manifest as nightmares, flashbacks, dissociation, things of that nature. In younger children, you might see repetitive traumatic play. Then you have avoidance is the next area. And with child sexual abuse, typically the avoidance is of thoughts and memories of the abuse, simply because avoiding the person or the place is unlikely, given that most of this happens within the home and by a trusted loved one. But they avoid those thoughts and memories because it causes them distress. Negative alterations in thoughts and mood. So you may have what we call dissociative amnesia. This is also another way of saying forgetting different parts of the abuse. You might also have negative expectations of yourself, of others, and the world around you, depressed affect, isolation, withdrawal, self-blame, things like that. The final area is disruptions in arousal, and with that you might have disruptions in sleep, hypervigilance, which is almost like just always being on guard, waiting for something to happen, thinking that something is about to happen. Then you might also have self-harming behaviors, emotional dysregulation, which is another way of saying an inability to manage one's emotions effectively. Instead, people with this emotional dysregulation tend to feel hijacked by their emotions and subject to their emotions. You may have poor concentration. Did someone have a question?
Thank you.
This one is the PowerPoint. You want to read it? Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
You want to all read?
I went ahead and muted, but if you do have a question, please feel free to come off or put it in the chat.
Okay, so on this, with these signs and symptoms, You would not expect to see all of these in one person. You would only expect to see one or two from each of these 4 areas. But that would be diagnostic criteria for trauma. Okay, then you have long-term impacts of child sexual abuse. And again, these are potential. Not everyone is going to have all of these. And it's just some things that we sometimes see that are correlated to a certain degree. Substance abuse, eating disorders. And I'm trying to go quickly so I have time for questions at the end, but let me explain a little bit on the substance abuse. Oftentimes that is to numb the effects, to numb the anxiety and to numb the distress that one might feel. Eating disorders, this is what you see sometimes for different reasons. It could be self-harming. It could also be a way to jolt yourself back into feeling something. It could be just due to your poor self-worth after being abused or your poor self-image. There are different reasons why eating disorders is associated sometimes. You have risky behaviors, self-destructive or self-harming behaviors. The suicidal ideation or attempts, this oftentimes comes from a deep loneliness of no one being able to understand what you're going through, feeling just so alone in your coping with everything. Oftentimes after telling, families are separated, a world falls apart, and this can lead to so much distress and depression as well. Difficulties with employment or even establishing and maintaining healthy relationships. So like I said, this can affect your trust in other people, because again, if you go back to the fact that this happens in your home with people that you trust, it's really hard for you to learn how to trust other people or how to know and feel confident that the people you trust are trustworthy because you've been so betrayed already. You might see diagnoses of anxiety, depression, borderline personality disorder. When you start to get all these different diagnoses though, where it's ADHD, ODD, bipolar, borderline, sometimes they will just be diagnosed with everything because no one considers the idea of PTSD. But if you consider PTSD, all of these other diagnoses actually seem to fit within that diagnosis. But that's not to say that you cannot have comorbid diagnoses, but usually when you see all these diagnoses without PTSD, it's because they didn't think about PTSD being an issue. So increased risk of physical health conditions like heart disease, diabetes, HIV or cancer, increased risk of re-victimization or sex trafficking, increased risk of early death due to disease, accident, suicide. And this all kind of goes back to the ACEs, right? We're all aware of that. Just, your childhood experiences can really help shape what your adult experiences are going to look like. Okay, so intervention strategies. So these are some of the empirically based strategies that are used with victims or survivors of abuse. So we have TFCBT, which is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, PSB CBT, which is the problematic sexual behaviors CBT, that's used with the youth with problematic sexual behaviors. Then you have EMDR, the parent-child interaction therapy. This is really helpful for parents who don't know how to respond to their children's outbursts or dysregulation. It helps them to practice with you in their ear, how to do that kind of thing. Dialectical behavior therapy, that really helps with decision making and making better decisions for yourself. Experiential therapies, so particularly with the younger ones, drawing and art therapy, that can help to articulate something that they have a hard time articulating. It can also be very sensory based, the art and drawing, which is really important oftentimes with abuse victims. Dance and movement for the same reason, it's very sensory based. Their sensory integration has been interfered with, so they have more of a disintegration of sensory input, and so this helps them to become more integrated, where they can become more in control of their movements, more mindful, things like that. Play therapy, especially for the young kids who don't know how to articulate what's going on or what happened to them. I've had plenty of great cases with play therapy. Then you have sand tray therapy, animal assisted therapy. These are all great. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's the ones that we here at the CAC use most frequently with our kiddos. But you could definitely add different ones onto that. Okay, and then also intervention strategies, some goals for therapy. So psychoeducation is a really, really big one. You need to teach them about grooming, secrecy, coercion, personal boundaries. Sometimes during the grooming educational part, I have this one game where you can talk about grooming and how it's different, how it can appear different to in different situations, and they match certain behaviors with different types of grooming. And it's during this point where oftentimes I'll see children say, oh, my person did that. Oh, that happened too, and that happened. And they start to realize they're not alone and that people have actually experienced this and can relate to them and understand what they went through. And it also helps to show them that they aren't to blame, that these techniques were used on them to manipulate them into doing all this. So also unsafe and safe touches. Obviously that needs to be age and developmentally appropriate. Human sexuality, also age appropriate education materials. For the younger ones, I have these little books that some include stickers and different things that can keep them engaged, but it goes through the appropriate versus inappropriate touch, what are private parts, things like that, that are interactive, and it helps with the conversation, to guide the conversation. Also, some goals are to help resolve their cognitive distortions, that it is not their fault, that they are not to blame. Also, to alleviate any guilt or fear. Identify thoughts and feelings toward their perpetrators, as well as their non-offending caregiver, self, siblings, etc. Oftentimes, kids will feel the pressure to hate the person that has abused them, but in reality, they do not hate this person. But they will struggle with the need to hate them because they're told they should hate them. Or they see that the non-offending caregiver has hate toward them. And in order to show loyalty to the non-offending caregiver or to align with them, they will pretend to hate. But that only serves to maintain their conflict and their struggle. And so oftentimes in therapy, when they've been given the permission to hate different parts, you can love parts of a person and not like parts of a person at the same time, that really is healing for them, because they're allowed to hate what they did, but also still love them and miss them and be honest and genuine to their own feelings. And that really helps to start the healing process for them too. Discriminate between sexual trauma and consensual intimacy or other healthy sex practices. Now, if the younger they are, if this is their first sexual encounter, they're going to view all sexual encounters potentially as harmful, scary, fearful, to be avoided, all of those things. But if they want to go on to have healthy interpersonal lives and potentially families, they need to see that there is a difference between healthy sexual practices and unhealthy / traumatic sexual practices. So helping them to recognize those things. And one thing I tell my kids too is, if the idea of virginity comes up, it's just an idea. Virginity is not a thing, really. It is an idea. And so to let them know it's okay to still say you're a virgin. You did not give your virginity to anyone. You did not give yourself to this person. You are still whole. And you are still worthy of a person to be in a relationship with and to give yourself to, if you decide to do that. But it really is helpful to them, because a lot of times they feel broken or ruined or defiled or whatever word they use. But it's really, really important to help them get back on the path of seeing themselves as integrated, as whole, as worthy, and just confident in themselves. And so that is, there are other goals, obviously, that you would have in therapy, but these are ones that, aside from the obvious of talking about the abuse if you need to or whatever, These are some of the ones I find to be very, very important that sometimes get overlooked. And so I wanted to make sure to include that. But that is all for my presentation. Does anyone have any questions or thoughts, critiques, anything?
Any questions, thoughts, feedback? There are some thanks starting to roll into the chat.
Oh, great. You're welcome. Thank you for being here. I just realized I did not put I do have resources. So the resources I use, the references, there's 2 pages of those. But I did not put my information on here, but Sydney, feel free if anyone wants to contact Sydney to get my email, Sydney, feel free to provide that. I'm happy to discuss further, or to answer any questions that might have gone, might come up later or have gone beyond, what we've talked about, but.
Sure. Well, that sounds good. And if you want, I can put your email in the chat.
Oh,
Or
perfect. Yeah.
okay, sure. Okay,
Yeah.
so put it in chat. Okay. Are there any questions from folks before I kind of give my wrap up? And I guess I actually will go ahead and say my wrap up. If you have questions, please put it in the chat in the meantime. So thank you so much, Dr. Carlson. This has been super informative for me, and I'm sure for many others. So we really appreciate your time and expertise and all the great resources and knowledge. For the participants who are seeking CEU information, please make sure that you take this survey that I'm about to place in the chat. With all caps. Please take that by the end of this month, so about 8 days or so, to be eligible for 2 hours of CEU credit. You will have needed to join by 10:15 a.m., stay till 12, take the survey by the deadline. And again, reminder that our CEUs are eligible for LMFTs, LPCs, LCDCs, CHWs, licensed psychologists, licensed social workers, and there's 7 groups. I'm going to put all the groups in the chat. But if you attend our events, you kind of are familiar with that already. There's 7 different providers who we provide for. And so yes, I'm putting that in the chat now. LMFTs, LPCs, licensed psychologists, licensed social workers, LCDCs, peer support specialists, and CHWs. Those are the groups eligible for CEU credit. And as another reminder, NBHP members receive CEU credit for free. So they attend and receive for free, and then non-members pay a small administrative fee to help us put on these events. So I placed in the chat Dr. Crowson's email address, also a link to the CEU survey and the groups who are eligible for CEU credit. And lastly, I did our website to figure out if you are a member of an NBHP organization, which I will say I think most of you all are, because I recognize most of the names in here. But yes, so thank you all so much. That is the CEU information. The slides and recording will be available afterwards, and I'll stay on for a couple minutes if there are any questions. But thank you all so much, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.
Thank you.